Okay. Take a breath.
We're gonna make it work.
We will. Okay, I think this is working now.
It says it's streaming live now.
Yeah, I think we're working. Says now we're
Okay.
streaming on Facebook.
All
So
right.
hi everybody. To those of you who are just joining the live cast, we're going to give people a few minutes to find us and then we'll get started. I know Dr. Damon's going to be sharing over to his page and I'm going to share over to my personal page. Yeah, we are live. It's working.
Okay. Awesome.
Always the great mystery. We were just saying before we went live here that technology is wonderful when it works and can be very frustrating when it doesn't. So.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Did you get it shared over your personal
Not
page?
shared just yet. I just pulled it up.
Just yet. Pulled it up.
Let
Great.
me see.
So hello everybody, to those of you who are just joining us. I'm giving Damon a minute here to get situated with some of the tech. Welcome to this evening's conversation that we've been sponsoring here on Mindful Ohio and the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. And the topic of tonight's conversation is eradicating the pandemic of racism. We've been hearing a lot in the last several months about both pandemics and racism, and I am incredibly excited to hear what Damon has to share with us tonight. So welcome. I'd like to introduce my guest tonight, Dr. Damon Silas, who's joining us from North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina area.
That's
right?
it. Yep.
Yeah. So I had the privilege of meeting Damon probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. He attended a workshop that I offered in Washington, D.C. area on trauma. And one of the ways we really connected was over dancing. Damon is a professional dancer and choreographer, in addition to being a very highly skilled therapist working with trauma. He's also an author. I was very moved by his memoir, From Morning to Night, which is a brilliant look into the interplay between grief and trauma. And Damon, it's my great pleasure to have you on the live cast tonight for us to have this conversation. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Jamie. It is a pleasure to be here and to just hang out with you. You know, I know, like you said, I met you several years ago, and I talk about you all the time, especially, I think I had mentioned when you reached out to me, I was speaking about you and dancing mindfulness the day before.
Okay.
Just in its power, and like, I just love what you do and what you continue to do for trauma and you know, all the people that you touch. So I'm just thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much. So you gave me a very compelling title for our talk tonight, Eradicating the Pandemic of Racism. So the floor is yours. Share with us what you'd like to on that.
Yeah, so I know it sounds really like a huge task, right? Like, how do we even eradicate the pandemic of racism? And part of the reason why I came up with that title was I was thinking about it in the context of COVID-19, the coronavirus, because it is a virus. And it's no surprise to me that all of this stuff is coming to the surface now during this time of a virus, right?
Yeah.
So when a body is weakened, it's more susceptible to other sicknesses.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that's exactly what we've been seeing in the society and this culture, is that once our society was weakened by this pandemic, and it's really about being in the space of the unknown. It's about being in the space of fear and worry and pain and grief and loss. A lot of people are grieving the loss of loved ones, you know, and even grieving the loss of life as we once knew it. So it's just brought a lot to the surface, what I've noticed in my personal work and my professional work with others. And so, again, it's not a surprise to me that then the roots of racism have really risen to the forefront and shown themselves to be the pandemic that racism is. Racism is a virus that has been running rampant through the society for years. And we've had the I'll say the privilege, the luxury of, and I say we, I think collectively there are us Black people, brown people, we've always known that it's existed. But I think for a lot of white people and people who don't have to think about it on a daily basis, they didn't have to think about it until life paused for all of us. And life paused, and it allowed us to see a couple of different things. It allowed us to see that we're all interconnected, you know, that to see the whole world just pause through this quarantine. But it also allowed us to see that there's a lot of stuff that we just haven't dealt with, you know, and I think what occurred and what has been occurring during this time period is that there is some stuff that we now can't unsee.
Yes.
When we were going about our daily lives, we could skate past those videos of Black and brown men being killed and women being killed. We could just act like it didn't exist. But when we're all sitting there watching that 8+ minute video of George Floyd taking his last breaths, you know, that puts us on a different playing field, and it allows the world literally to see what Black and brown people have been trying to say for years.
Yeah. Agreed. And you said something very compelling that really struck me very viscerally about how, you know, people who are white don't think about this on a daily basis, if ever. And I think that's the very definition of privilege, because I know a lot of white people in my circles get antsy whenever that word privilege gets brought up for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now. I mean, I think it's well known to you what those reasons are. But yeah, because I remember growing up with racism being presented to me as something that was a thing of the past. And then the more I started meeting people who are from different backgrounds than my own, I realized, wait, that is definitely not the case. But it wasn't something I was attuned to until I was at least, you know, in the double-digit ages. So yeah, I'm just very struck by that comment, and that is one of the very definitions of privilege, that if racism isn't something that you have to think about on a regular basis, let alone think about at all, that probably means you are very highly privileged. And it's time to listen to people who do have to think about this or struggle with it or feel it on a daily basis.
Right.
So with that being said, is it okay if I ask you a little bit about your personal experiences with this virus?
Sure.
At least what you're willing to share tonight. So if you could share with our listeners a little bit about maybe where you're from, what you'd like to share about your story, and how you started becoming aware that this virus was something that was out to get you.
Sure. So I am originally from Massachusetts. I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Air Force, and so we moved around a lot. I actually grew up in a mixed race. My parents were of mixed race. So my dad was Black, mom is white. And so there was already the awareness, and I wouldn't even say awareness, because as a kid, you just know your parents, right?
Right.
But I remember just hearing conversations and knowing that there was something there that made us different than a lot of our peers. So I grew up primarily my formative years in Oklahoma. And it was then I had like a very mixed group of friends, Black, white, like Asian, Latino. It was just kind of this melting pot living on military bases, and especially that one in particular. And I remember there was this one instance where a really good friend of ours, he was a white kid, and it was like 4 or 5 of us Black kids. And then my mom was like, you know what? He can't hang out with you anymore. His mom told him that he's no longer allowed to hang out with you all. And I was like, why? And she said, well, it's because you all are Black. And so at that moment, like, and I was probably, 9, 10. And it, you know, it was in that moment I realized, okay, so here we are. But it wasn't like a big deal. I just knew that it pointed out a difference that I was already kind of aware of. So fast forward to we moved back to Massachusetts my high school year. And being one of maybe 10 persons of color in a school of about 1,600 did nothing but highlight that difference of what it was like to stand out. You know, I stood out in terms of my accent because I had kind of a Oklahoma twang to what I said. I stood out in terms of our skin color.
Yeah.
And so it was really challenging, and it was always in my face. You know, I had white cousins who I remember they would tell stories of being around other white people, and they would use the N word, and they would say things about Black people. And my cousins would be like, hold on, you know, we have family who is Black. So fast forward to just driving, you know, and I posted this on Facebook the other day. And it's one of those things where you think you're going to be immune to it, because for me, I was like, oh, I follow all the rules of the road.
Yeah.
And my dad used to always say, son, you're not going to be immune to it. You know, just, you got to be safe, follow the rules of the road, and you should be okay. However, there are odds and chances that you will not be, as he had not been, and my brother had not been. And sure enough, one of the first times I was pulled over, I was working for an organization, and we worked very closely with the police department in Boston.
Right.
And I was on my lunch break, came back, and I was about to make a U-turn to go back to work. And a cop pulled up behind me, and I took that U-turn, and he was still behind me. And so I pulled up into the driveway and reached over to my glove compartment to get my registration, because I was like, all right, I've been primed for this. I know how this works. Let me get my license, my registration. Reached over, and as I looked back, it was like 2 or 3 police officers, and they had their guns in my face. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I looked, and there was like 5 or 6 other undercover, police cars behind me. And it was, what they said was, I ran a school bus stop sign, which there wasn't a school bus that was even in sight. And they said I fit the profile of somebody who had shot a police officer earlier that week and had ran through an alley. And at that point, it became really real to me, like to the point where it's like, oh, this can be a life or death thing.
Yeah.
So, and there were other instances of being pulled over, arrested. And it's just one of those things where you wish that it didn't have to happen. I wish that I didn't have these stories to tell. And I'm fortunate that I lived to tell the story for the many people who haven't been fortunate enough to tell those stories.
Yes. Thank you for your willingness to share that. And I mean, I've been well aware, the more I've known Black people and people of color, about this talk that parents have with their children in Black communities. And I mean, I don't know what to say other than that was never a talk I received. It was never a talk I've known any white people to receive. And I think it paints a stark picture about what we're dealing with here.
And even just the thought of, I remember my parents asking, or my brother and friends asking, did you have a hat on backwards? Because maybe that's one of the reasons why they pulled you over too. And I was thinking, wow, like I really have to be consciously aware of even what I'm wearing and how I present myself as I'm driving, and walking and doing whatever else. Yeah.
So in some of our conversations, and I'm just kind of messing around with my other computer over here just to see if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to pass along. If you are watching this live, as I see several of you are, many of you are actually, please go ahead and post it in the comments, and I'd be happy to read it if it's relevant to our conversation, or pass a question along. So Damon, you are a trauma therapist. You do quite a lot with helping people heal from trauma. So I really want to pick your brain about, this whole metaphor that we're working with today, which is the pandemic, racism as a pandemic that, has been with us for centuries, really since the founding of this nation, at least, and in other contexts around the globe, but probably most ugly here. And I could say that based on what I've done in some study. But as we were talking back and forth on Messenger, we talked about that if we're really going to eradicate this pandemic of racism, there's a vaccination period, a navigation period, and then hopefully, treatment and eradication. So
Mhm.
I guess if we start with vaccination, which we tend to think of as the preventative measure, in your experiences as a person of color, in your experience as a trauma therapist,
Mhm.
what do we need to do as a preventative measure here? What would do white folks, people of color, people of all races and backgrounds, policy, whatever you want to speak to? I want to hear your take.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with the trauma piece because when we look at trauma, we have to look at the fact that this is something that has been passed down from generation to generation
Yeah.
from the beginning of the founding of this country, and that includes both Black and white people, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I
Hmm.
was having this conversation, and you actually suggested my grandmother's hands book.
Yes.
Oh my goodness, like yes, thank you so much for suggesting that. Wow, it hits the nail on the head. I haven't finished it, but
Hmm.
he's absolutely on point with that. This is something that's literally in our DNA,
Hmm.
whether it's as the oppressed or as the oppressor.
Hmm.
And so recognizing that, I think, is the first and foremost thing that we all need to do. Is this is just something that's been encoded in our DNA and in our bodies, where we have to understand that. Excuse me. And let me just turn my phone off. Sorry, my phone was on or off
Okay.
airplane mode, so I can
Yeah.
connect. And then,
Yeah.
um, but so it's just recognizing that. Then it's getting to the place where, like, people coming into the office for therapy, they have to get to the place where they understand that their pain is so much that they need to do something about it, unless they're going to continue
Hmm.
down the same path. Right. So just being able to admit and have that awareness is so important. Same for white people, right? Admit and be aware. It's not a clean process. It's not an
Hmm.
easy process. It's not without discomfort or pain or any of those things. And that's okay. I
Hmm.
don't want to take any of that away from you. Like if somebody comes into the office and they have a history of trauma, I'm not going to try to take that away from them and take their pain and sadness and hurt away from them. I'm going to look at what led to that and then get to the root of, which is really what eradicating something is. It's
Right.
getting to the root of what occurred at the beginning of this trauma or even before this trauma,
Yeah.
so we can start to tap into that,
Hmm.
right? Because if we focus on the symptoms, and let me say this, I got to say it loud and clear. I think
Go.
so many people get focused on the symptoms rather than how we can get to the root of healing this. When we
Sure.
get caught up in, yeah, but he shouldn't have been doing this, or he shouldn't have been doing that, or she shouldn't have been doing this, or we get caught up in, yeah, but the looters and the rioters, you're focusing on the symptoms.
That's right.
We got to get to, well, why are they so angry and why are they burning down these stores, and why are they taking from these stores, and why are people a little hesitant when the police come up behind them? So
Mhm.
we have to really get to it's really convenient, I think, for people to play that armchair therapist and that
Oh
armchair
God, yes.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. So getting to the root of why people are feeling the way that they're
Yeah.
feeling and how we can start to heal that, right? And
Right.
being able to heal it is about working through it. We can't go around it. We can't take a pill for it. So if y'all thought that there was a pill for racism, I'm sorry, and that I have to be the one to break the bad news to you. There
Hmm.
is no pill to cure it, and there is a way to address it that is very powerful, which is having conversations like these,
Right.
being able to be in conversation and tough dialogue, and reflecting on, have I ever said or done something that could have been perceived as such? And it means nothing about you as a person. It
Hmm.
simply means that you are a product of this environment. You are a
Right.
product of this culture. You are a product of this society, which means it's worked perfectly up to this point.
And we're speaking very similar languages here about trauma, because my whole shtick on this, my whole feeling on this, which is that trauma is a wound. If you look at what the word trauma actually means, trauma is wound. And if wounds remain unhealed, they bleed and they fester, which can not only cause problems to the individual experiencing them, but then we can bleed all over everybody else and cross-contaminate.
Yes. You know what? I've referenced you twice this week.
Uh-oh.
Because as you said that, it reminded me of something that you said in that training years ago,
Yeah.
where it was, we have so many people who are walking around bleeding on each other, like just bumping into each other with their open wounds.
Yes.
Yep.
And the book that you referenced that you and I were talking about the other day, it's kind of the book of the hour, but with good reason. It's called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, who is a clinical social worker who has done a lot of work with social justice training and race relations training. And he's a somatic experiencing practitioner, meaning he has a lot of trauma-informed views over all of this. And I think one of the wisest things I've taken from this book at this point is that when you as an individual, whatever your race or background, when you have been wounded, if in the lack of resources or healing or ability to heal those wounds, you tend to take it out on other people. And it tends to be the people that just the other that you can pick on, whoever that other is taught to be. And it's interesting because I went to visit my uncle, my maternal uncle. I was on Sunday. I was just driving through my old neighborhood where I grew up, and I stopped by and visited him. And we were talking about, even as Eastern Europeans, we're of Croatian American background. He remembers how other European immigrants would talk about, oh, the Hungarians, they're weird in their ways. The Italians, stay away from them. They're weird in their ways. And then, of course, I mean, I think that's why we see a lot of people of European, especially Eastern European descent, beating up literally or figuratively on African Americans or people of color. Like, oh, they're really different. And because we've been treated like shit by people who might be more Anglo-Saxon or people in higher power structures, let's look at the other guy who's in a lower place.
Absolutely.
That we can bleed all over because my core wound hasn't been addressed.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're going to look towards somebody who can take our pain, or we can give them our pain, because, we'll project that onto them. It's safer and it feels better to get it out that way.
And the line that Resmaa uses in that book is, we keep blowing our trauma through us onto other people. And that's a repetitive line that I keep hearing over and over in that book. And I think that is what makes this a pandemic. Because obviously in the wake of COVID, right, we've learned a lot about how diseases transmit.
Right. Like, could you imagine if with racism, like, people just walked around with a mask and just didn't say some of the things that they really wanted to say? Like, if they didn't Karen over everybody, or and that just prevented them from spewing their anger and their hurt and their own personal pain on somebody else.
Right. And I'm really glad you brought up at the beginning that what we're in right now, I mean, we're still in a physical pandemic with COVID.
Let's not forget
that because we're all paying attention to media or paying attention to events, whatever it may be, we're more aware in a way that maybe we weren't before. But the other challenge I want to make to people, and Damon, I want to get your take on this, is on an idea I put out there at the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which is that whenever physical illness tends to be at play, we tend to pay attention more than when it comes to emotional or social or spiritual types of illnesses or traumas that we transmit. Because at the beginning of COVID, when I saw all these precautions being taken, like 6 feet away, wash your hands, wear masks, don't, cancel big events. I mean, I respect that. And I respect that that's what we need to do to at least flatten the curve of a pandemic. But I was kind of shouting from the rooftops, why haven't we been doing this with trauma? Why haven't we been doing this with the things that cause addiction and these social problems? Why can't we take these same universal best precautions?
I'm telling you. Could you imagine how different this world, this society would look if we focused on trauma that same way?
Yeah.
Like, if we said, okay, you know what, if you have trauma, we're going to need for you to do this, this. And then we can start to flatten that trauma curve of what's been passed down and what continues to be passed down from generation to generation. Like this whole world would be different. I mean, we're talking, it impacts how people show up to work, how they show up in their communities, like you said,
in their families, and how they parent, how they are in relationship.
Right. And so you add on trauma to the burden of what Black people have held on to for so many years without the outlets of therapy. You know, a lot of Black people aren't going to therapy, maybe because they just don't trust, they don't see somebody who looks like them to provide that support for them. Maybe they don't have the means to do so, whatever it is. So you're talking about so much unresolved trauma that then is brought out to the people who are closest to them, or again, somebody who appears to be less than, or, you know, just feels better to put their stuff onto.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah. I'm flowing right now with a line from Pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's one of my favorite progressive preachers. And I cite this in my new book that's out. She says, I think as a people, our drug of choice is thinking we're better than other people. Finding that one person or that one group to lord over as a way to, you know, why do we use any drug? To feel better without getting to the root cause.
Yeah. And I can't help but think of even somebody had referenced earlier this week, the Stanley Milgram, you know, and just being how we can easily be swayed by, you know, in positions, especially in positions of power, to take advantage of people, even if sometimes we don't even want to. Right. And I think that speaks to those people who say, yeah, but I'm not that way. And it doesn't mean that you still don't subconsciously do some of these and engage in some of these behaviors that can be seen as microaggressions or macroaggressions. But I think it's just being aware of that. Like, and it's not a fault in your character. It's just a representation and a mirror of what the society is taught, you know? And when you're put in certain positions, it's, you do have a choice. You know, and I think right now people are realizing, wait, I don't have to walk through life. It's almost like so many people are just sleepwalking through life. And this really woke everybody up. Like, oh, okay, so we got some things that we're dealing with. It's time to wake up. And once you're awake, now you can start to, you know, make those choices that are now different than they would have been before. Right.
So do you think that's going to happen in the US? Because I do, something feels, and this sounds so shitty to say, but I'm just going to say it, that police violence is nothing new. I mean, I've been a police violence, especially towards people of color, and it seems like almost when a Black man gets killed, when a trans woman of color gets killed, when there's a school shooting, there can be this temporary outrage, and then we kind of go back into that same sleepwalking. Does this feel different to you? And do you think that there's going to be, you know, more collective action here? Are you seeing that?
Absolutely. Like I can't even imagine, I can't even remember, a time in our lifetimes that this energy towards change has been so strong. You know, and I remember just thinking about this several years ago, like it started to feel like there was a bigger shift in this, in the collective consciousness of how we do things in this country, in this society. And I'm speaking, you know, just to us in particular. And this is going to sound weird, but honestly, I think we need, and we have needed, those who are in positions of power right now to be exactly where they are right now in order to illuminate all this stuff that much more, right? To illuminate the paradoxical ways that we that we operate, to illuminate the hypocritical ways that we so often could overlook before.
I'm getting the word diuretic or enema coming up as you're talking about people who are in power right now. And
Yep.
this is maybe, this is part of the great cleansing that we're being challenged to experience.
How you get it out. Yep.
And I'm so compelled by how you even started this talk, that maybe it has taken this physical pandemic of COVID to get us not just paying attention to what's happening. But I also think, to my point about why we care so much about physical illness and physical pandemics, is it illuminates life and death, which is, I think, the thing that we as a people tend to fear the most, right? Which is our physical death. And I know you work a lot with grief. So I guess I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. That is it that, we've dealt with an unprecedented amount of death in this country in the last 3 to 4 months, physical death. Look at the numbers, and look at the numbers of people of color that have been affected disproportionately. And I mean, I still feel I'm almost numbing out a little bit of the reality of that.
Yeah.
Just how many people we've lost.
The numbers. Yeah. Yeah. And initially it was was of shock. It was of fear, like you said.
Yeah.
I mean, that's our instinct, is to, stay away from death, right? So we can survive and pass down our genes and all those things. So, it's no surprise to me, again, that this did happen during this time, because, you just have people who are afraid, and all that fear is now up to the surface. And what do you do with that? So, like you said, there's this life or death thing, excuse me, that's happening, but it's also the grief and loss piece too. Right. So as I was saying earlier, it's a grief and loss of a lot of actual lives. Like we're at like over 111 or 112,000. Like that's the most in any country. Like that's far above and beyond the numbers of any other country, developed or not, which is really unfortunate. But the other thing is, again, with coronavirus, we're all equally susceptible unless we take some of these precautions. Whereas for racism, it was only a subset of the population, right? Like, so not everybody really had to pay attention, but because we're on this equal kind of playing field in terms of our mortality, now we all have to pay attention. We're all on high alert. So it allowed people to see, okay, we're all like susceptible to this, and what can we do to just get out of this alive? And yeah.
No, I mean, I'm agreeing. I think both of us have a pretty similar answer here, which is encourage people to work on their stuff, encourage people to heal trauma. Which on one hand sounds like the obvious answer, right? But it's so much like, how do we get people to look at it, their own stuff, their own trauma? Because I know for me and people I've worked with, once they've done some trauma healing, life changes. But there's still that resistance and again, resistance is a weird word, because all resistance is about something. But like you mentioned, in the Black community, for instance, therapy is very largely stigmatized. In a lot of facets of Caucasian life, it can be too, depending on people's backgrounds. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on how we even get people motivated to do the work? Their own trauma work? And that's a big question that I still wrestle with myself,
I know, I am I feel a sense of hope when I look on Instagram, for instance, and see a lot of people saying, talking about Black therapy and Black therapists, and how therapy is cool and therapy is dope. So that to me just fills my spirit of, man, I've been trying to I've been wanting to normalize therapy for years, right? Like I've been doing this for like 98 or so, but so it's really cool to see like this next generation
Mm-hmm.
of therapists and just next generation saying, yeah, it's cool. Like
Mm-hmm.
going to therapy is a cool thing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think just the more it's in the vernacular of,
Yeah.
this culture, then I mean, you have NBA players and NFL players and
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of people rap stars, hip hop,
Right. Mm-hmm.
artists, and they're talking about going to therapy. So I think the more that we do that, the more we
Right.
just allow people to feel like it's okay. It is
Right.
okay to process your stuff. And the point is, we all have stuff. Like we can call it trauma, we can call it hurt, we can call it pain, we can call it whatever we want,
Wounds. Yeah.
but we
Mm-hmm.
all have stuff,
Yeah.
And so whether you think it's impacting you or not, it is.
Right.
And especially if you're a person of color, it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, and I think, again, it's just continuing to normalize that and to let people know, like, we all have our own stuff. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think I said in my book too, like, multiple times, I've been to therapy this time and that time and that,
Right.
like, and really for me, it was, I would be doing clients a disservice if I went in there
Mm-hmm.
not processing my own stuff.
Yes.
And too often, I think, I'm going to bring it back to coronavirus, but too often people don't realize the disservice that they're doing to their fellow human by not processing their stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are the people who, and no disrespect to anybody out there, but I have to say it, like when you go into a public place, like let's say a grocery store, and a lot of people are wearing masks, and you say, I don't need to wear a mask. While I get it and while I hear you, it's not just about you,
Exactly.
right? So just because we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just
Yeah.
because you can't see your trauma, just because you can't see racism, just because you
Mm-hmm.
can't see coronavirus, doesn't mean they don't exist.
Right.
And so it's okay to put your mask on and protect yourself. And by protecting yourself, you're also protecting others and vice versa. So we're all interconnected and we're all interrelated, and it's okay to care for yourself and your fellow human.
Point very well taken. So another thought I had, I want to talk a little bit about the arts, like dance. Because for some people who maybe aren't feeling prepared yet or willing yet to go to therapy, the arts are an outlet, or the arts can be a powerful adjunct to doing professional therapy. So can you share with me a little bit maybe about some of how the arts have helped you in your journey and what role you might see it in helping others?
Yeah. So first and foremost, as I was saying, I was talking about you the other day because I actually did a mindful movement workshop with a good friend of mine, Ayanna Parent, up in on the Cape in Massachusetts. And she's a social worker up there and has her own coaching
Yeah.
company. And she does a lot of work, yoga and
Mm-hmm.
movement, etc. And so we collaborated also with somebody else, Manny Marrero, who did some meditation. But really what I did is I curated a playlist. And this was before I saw your playlist the other day. I was like, yes, a lot of my songs made the same playlist.
Nice.
So I curated a playlist where people can express anger and frustration and hopelessness and hope and optimism and all those things, the range of emotions that we are all been feeling. So it's important to get it out of our bodies through
Mm-hmm.
movement. The other thing, I've been talking to another psychologist friend of mine, and we were talking about doing some work around just the creative side of our expression.
Yeah.
So I know for me, I've written a lot of raps and poetry just since I actually started being more intentional about it since January. And so, getting these thoughts onto paper and expressed through music. I've been writing a lot of just pieces and blogs and whatnot. So, it's just really about engaging all parts of the mind. And I long for the day where people understand that with therapy, which you've done such a beautiful job, which is why I love following you, because you've done a great job understanding that it's not just about doing therapy up here, but it's about doing therapy all up and down. Like it's all interconnected.
That's right. the body's interconnected, the whole self is interconnected, just as we're interconnected with each other. So just thank you for that. I had one specific question that came through on the feed for you that I would like to know your answer to this too. So this came from Janice Kaufman-Young, who was on our live cast, one of our live casts last week.
Okay.
And she talked about being a mother of 3 Black sons and the conversation that we even referenced on this call. And she said, do you think that we'll ever be able to not have that conversation with our children in our lifetimes about being, watching yourself with the cops and how to act? Do you see a day where we won't have to have that conversation?
You want my optimistic?
Go, just riff.
Gosh, sorry, and I started getting like a little emotional about it, just because I would love to say I believe that there is a day in the future where that will not be the case. I think a lot of it, I'm gonna talk about policing for a minute.
Go.
Because I think there's 2 issues. There's the policing, but then there's what's even above that, which is, policy and what's passed down to the police departments, right? So you have to think about, and I'm going to get back to the point, but I'm thinking about just the history of the militarization of our police right now. Right? And you have to look at what happened after 9/11 is all these police departments started getting all these tactical gear and militarized equipment that led to where we are right now. And so part of the work, and I've worked with the police department, I mean, this is no knock on anybody, because I think, they too have trauma. So I get it. And so once we kind of demilitarize our police departments, we might get a little closer. We might get a little closer to that time where the police are really there to just protect and serve, right? To not harass, to not terrorize. And that's really what they've been doing. And we see it live in person. Like we're seeing it in action, like right in front of our eyes, like at all these protests for against police brutality. They're brutalizing people. And it's a very intimidating thing to see a police officer with all that gear. Like it immediately, I mean, just watching it brings up your fear. So when you're pulled over, for instance, and you see somebody walking up with all this gear and a big gun across their chest, like it's going to naturally, like there's not logical thought in that. So I think we need to demilitarize and so there's a lot of talk about defunding the police. Let's be clear, it doesn't mean taking away all of their money. It just means maybe $6 billion isn't needed to fund a city's police department. Like that to me is insanity.
And it's treating the symptom.
And it's treating the symptom, right?
Instead of the root cause,
So imagine if we could just divert some of those funds to education,
right,
to mental health, physical health, to opening back up gyms and playgrounds and whatever it is. There are so many things that money could be put towards. So now the police really are just there to protect and serve, because now we're focusing on the trauma of the people in the community who you're harassing and who you're brutalizing. So imagine if a cop, their only job was to pull you over if you were going over the speed limit and just, give you a ticket, but, that's it. But I was reading something the other day. How different would it be if a cop pulled over and it wasn't even like a cop as we know it, but maybe the car looks different. Maybe there aren't flashing lights, because again, all those things trigger us. They immediately bring up our fight, flight, or freeze response. So, and that's just such a natural thing. But imagine if it was just somebody in an undercover car or whatever, or a public safety officer who pulled you over and said, "Hey, I noticed your taillight is out. I have an extra taillight. Do you want me to help you fix it, or do you need a referral to go to somebody to help you fix it?" Imagine how different that would be, instead of assuming that you did wrong or assuming that you're coming from a place of bad. So, all right, so defunding, or diverting the funds of the police department so that they don't even appear as intimidating to people that they pull over, first. And secondly, I think some of it is education. There's education out there, like for people to recognize their inherent biases, I mean, is great. There's still work to do. So I don't see that being an issue. I don't see that discontinuing in the near future. I do think the more people are out there protesting, but also making helping to make policy changes, hopefully the police just change the way that they look at how they actually police.
Yes.
I know that was a really long-winded response to that question, but I hope that gave some answer. I truly do hope that stops being the case at some point.
For sure. As do I. And I also hope, and I tell people this, and I mean this sincerely from the bottom of my heart, I would love to see a day where the work that I do isn't required, where we all know how to be good to each other and we don't hurt each other and we don't wound each other. We don't live in that world, and I don't know. I mean, I guess I live and I do the work with the hope that we can plant seeds, and those seeds can grow into something that really is a force for positive change. And I've shared it on these casts before. I mean, I know that is possible on a micro level with people, because the way I grew up and the way I am now are two totally different people, just how we are in the world. And it's all because I've had trauma healing. And so, I know change is possible, but I think it can feel very intimidating when we think about it on a macro level. But I think we're being really forced to think about it on both that micro and macro level now. So.
Yeah, it's icky, it's sticky, it's gross. And again, it leads to the changes that, like you said, now you can be available for other people. And I think once people start to understand that, and it's that one seed that's planted, and what's really reassuring to me is working with white clients who are like, oh my goodness, this is horrible, this is awful, I want to do some work. And it allows us to have the conversation about what kind of messages they're sending their children, right? And that to me is beautiful. Like, awesome. That's where you start. Like, you get to start at home. What a gift to not only you, but your children and their children's children. Like, you get to rewrite the narrative starting at home. So I hope people don't discount the work that they can do starting right where they are within their homes. And like you said, going to therapy and doing that work.
Yes. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. How can people find you and your work if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, so they could connect on Facebook under Dr. Damon Silas, CSG Coach. So I think it's at CSG Coach Damon. And
I'll tag you.
Okay, yeah, and I think you've already done that. Yep.
Yeah.
And then they can find me on Instagram at Dr. Damon Silas. That's DRDAMON SILAS. And website is DamonSilasPsychology.com.
Great. Wonderful. So to anybody still hanging out, watching with us, we have live casts every night this week. So Damon kicked us off. Tomorrow night, we'll be talking with a social worker from Florida who I've not met yet. But I'm very happy to have her on, Soraya Popayute. She'll be speaking about transgenerational trauma in the Black African-American community. And then on Thursday night, that one will be at 7:30. We'll be talking with Blaze Harris, who's also from North Carolina, the Raleigh-Durham area, who is a mental health clinician and a firefighter by background, who is passionate about men's mental health in the Black community. And so the title of his live cast is simply Black Men Feel. So join us on Thursday night at 7:30 for that. And then we'll have a couple more up next week as well. So again, thanks to all of you who have been courageous enough to take part in this conversation and to at least listen. And once again, Damon, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Jamie. I really appreciate it.